This is a continuation of Living Together. The first part was already published and is up, and this is just a continuation of that lecture. So where we left off was looking at ethical concerns around the study that was conducted with 14 ancestors' remains at Chaco Canyon. So once we established that there were ethical concerns and that there was definitely a divide between the scientific community and the notion of traditional knowledge that was not used in order to basically formulate the study, another additional piece of evidence comes to the forefront. While I was visiting Chaco Canyon, I learned from one of the park rangers that the Pueblo people had just been at Chaco Canyon. Some members of the Zuni Pueblo had come to visit Chaco Canyon. I learned from the park ranger that they oftentimes will come and visit. It's where they come to not only learn, but they also come to perform ceremonies because they do have close ties to what happened at Chaco Canyon, and their ancestors were part of Chaco Canyon. So what I learned from the park ranger is that several members of the Zuni Pueblo tribe had come to visit Chaco Canyon, and they had not even heard of this study conducted by the scientists on their ancestral remains. And so that day they were learning for the first time from the park ranger that ancestral remains had been taken, had been basically ground to powder so that they could extract the DNA to be studied and in order to use for this determination of what Chaco Canyon had looked like and to try to understand a little bit more about the social structure of Chaco Canyon. So what I learned from the park ranger is that the Zuni Pueblo who had visited that day were visibly upset by what they were learning for the first time. They had not been contacted, they had not been told that this was a possibility, nor did they know that ancestral remains from Chaco Canyon were being held by the Natural History Museum. So the second big issue that the paper from advocates, indigenous advocates and indigenous members of different tribes throughout Canada and the United States raised in their paper is that by performing this study and then publishing this paper, they had published a paper where there was culturally insensitive language. They used objectifying language to describe the ancestors of the Pueblo and the Navajo people. That objectifying language was cranium 14 and burial 14, instead of acknowledging that these were ancestors of people who were still living within the United States. They referred to them as skeletal remains. So the third major issue that was raised by advocates was that this study has a huge impact on modern tribes and citizens. Past scientific research, as you know from having studied Indian history, has created a history of mistrust. There have been a lot of miscommunications, and by continuing this, it will continue a sentiment of mistrust among Native tribes and scientists and other community members who would like to learn about American Indian history. Currently, only 0.05 of Native people participate in genomic research. This has huge impacts on the sort of data that is available in order to create healthcare remedies for Native people. So by being unequally represented within the genomic research, there's healthcare inequalities and an inability to create medicine to remedy a lot of the ills that Native people face today. Some of the current health issues that we can see is that overall, Native people today have a life expectancy that is 5 years lower than most people in the United States, than all people in the United States. They also suffer from higher rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, accidents, alcoholism, and assault. Those higher rates, if you want to look at the fact sheet, are listed So these are higher rates than all races. So by not having the capacity to provide genomic data, Native people and their mistrust of the scientific community are suffering, and a lot of their health needs are not being met as a result of that. So the question remains, after all of this, after having gone through hundreds of years of American Indian history, where we learned since the beginning there was conflict between Native views of history and other views of history, of how we understand where that comes from, what it means, whether it's science, whether it's oral history. The question today is, how do we go from here? Where do we go from here? There are still clearly misunderstandings happening. Where do these come from? Why are they still happening? There is a conflict still today between scientific knowledge and the value of scientific knowledge versus indigenous knowledge. How can we grow? How can we continue to contribute to that growth as now students of American Indian history? And my final question that I pose to you is, are we responsible for that growth? Now having some knowledge about American Indian history and seeing that story, what can you bring forth today as a citizen of the United States to make this a new story, to create a new chapter in American Indian history?